The morning of the betrothal breakfast at Briarholt Hall, the great hall went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when 200 people see the same thing at once, and none of them dares to be the first to speak. Adriana stood near the servants' door, with a pot of chocolate cooling in her hands, and she watched Florentia descend the staircase in a gown of palest celadon silk, and she knew the gown the way a mother knows the turn of her own child's shoulder. She had cut it. She had stitched it. The seed pearls along the bodice had passed through her own fingers in the dark of 3 winter mornings, and the silver thread at the hem traced a pattern she had drawn from memory of her dead mother's garden. And every eye in that hall lifted to Florentia, and called the work beautiful, and called it hers. A footman murmured that the bride had never looked finer. A dowager near the windows said the girl had taste beyond her years. The Earl of Briarholt, standing at the foot of the stairs in a navy coat cut close to his shoulders, looked up at the woman descending toward him in Adriana's own design, and did not smile, and did not frown, and only watched with an attention so still it might have been carved. Adriana set the chocolate down before her hands could betray her. She had 3 seconds, perhaps 4, before someone noticed the seamstress staring at the bride. She used them to memorize the precise angle of the silver thread at Florencia's hem, because she would need to remember, later, that she had not imagined this, that the work was hers, that the theft was real. Then she lowered her eyes and curtsied to the floor and became invisible again, which was the only safety the world had ever offered her. To begin properly, one must go back 6 months, to the 3rd week of October, when Adriana Verendale first carried her needle into the town of Maycomb, with nothing to her name but the trade her mother had left her, and a letter of introduction that no one read. She had been gentry once. Her father had held a modest acreage near Selsdon and a name that opened doors, until a bad harvest and a worse investment in a Bristol shipping concern carried both away inside a single year, and then carried him away too. In a fever, he had no strength left to fight. Adriana was 23 when she buried him. By the spring she had sold the last of the furniture, and by the autumn she had understood that a lady with no fortune and no family is not a lady at all, but a problem the world prefers to solve by forgetting her. What the world did not know, because the world had never looked closely, was that her mother had been the daughter of a French émigré modiste, and had taught her only daughter the whole of a vanishing craft before the consumption took her. Adriana could cut a bodice that fit a woman like water fits a glass. She could embroider a hem so fine that the stitches disappeared into the silk and left only the image floating there, a garden, a flight of swallows, a border of ivy that seemed to grow as you watched it. She did not advertise this. A gentlewoman who sews for money has fallen, and a fallen gentlewoman is fair game. So she took a back room above a chandler's shop on Guildmore Street, and she let it be known quietly, through a laundress and a kitchen maid, that there was a young woman who could remake a tired gown into something a duchess might envy. The work found her. It always did. The first commission was a widow's mourning gown turned for a 2nd season. The dye gone rusty at the seams, and Adriana unpicked it to the bones and rebuilt it so that the woman who collected it stood at the cracked glass and did not, for a moment, recognize her own grief made graceful. The widow paid in coins still warm from her glove, and told 3 friends, and the 3 told others. And by Advent, the orders came faster than the daylight allowed. Adriana worked through the short afternoons until her eyes ached and the candle stubs guttered, and she ate bread and dripping, standing at the window so as not to lose the light. And she told herself that this was not a fall, but a kind of standing still, which is the lie a proud woman tells herself to keep her hands steady. By Christmas, she had more than she could manage, and she had taken on a girl named Tamzil to help her, a sharp-eyed apprentice from the poorhouse, with hands that learned faster than any Adriana had ever taught. The child had come to the door asking for nothing but to watch, and Adriana, remembering her own mother at the candle, had given her a needle instead of a coin. Within a month, Tamzil could set a sleeve. Within 2, she could be trusted with seed pearls, which Adriana trusted to no one. They worked the long evenings in a companionable quiet, the apprentice and the fallen lady, and for the first time since Selsdon, the cold room held something that was almost warmth. It was Madame Pello who undid her. Madame Pello kept the grandest modiste establishment in Maycomb, a shop front of glass and gilt on the better end of Gilmore Street, and she had a clientele that Adriana could never reach and a reputation that Adriana's work could ruin. When the ladies began to whisper that the most exquisite needlework in the county came not from Madame Pello's gilded rooms, but from a back stair above a chandler's, Madame Pello did the sensible thing. She did not fight the talent. She bought it. The arrangement was simple and humiliating and necessary. Adriana would design and execute the finest commissions. Madame Pello would present them as her own house's work, take the lion's share of the fee, and pass Adriana enough to keep her in thread and rent. Adriana's name would appear nowhere. Her hands would be in everything and her name in nothing. And that, Madame Pello explained, with a small, cool smile, was the price of eating. Adriana agreed. A woman who must choose between pride and bread learns quickly which one she can live without. And so when the order came for a betrothal gown, the most important commission the house had ever taken, Adriana did not know whose betrothal it was. She knew only the measurements, sent on a slip of paper, and the instruction that no expense was to be spared, and the strange specific request that the design must include, somewhere upon it, a motif of forget-me-nots worked in silver. She wept a little, the first night, over that request. Her mother's garden at Selsdon had been thick with forget-me-nots, small and stubborn and blue, and her mother had loved them past all sense, and had said once, threading a needle by candlelight, that a woman should always leave her mark in a place no one thinks to look. Adriana had not understood her then. She understood her now. She worked the silver forget-me-nots into the hem of that celadon gown, and because the request had named the flower but not the manner of it, she worked them in her own way, a way her mother had invented and taught to no one else living. Each small flower had 5 petals, and the 5th petal, on every bloom, was left a single stitch short and closed instead, with a knot turned inward, so that the flower read as whole from any distance but carried, hidden in its heart, a deliberate flaw that only its maker would ever think to make. She did not know, as she stitched it, that she was signing the gown. She did not know whose body would wear it, either. Until the fitting, Florentia Coswick came to Madame Pello's establishment on a gray afternoon in February, and Adriana was permitted to attend the fitting only as the silent hands behind the curtain, kneeling to pin the hem while the modiste flattered and the client preened. Florentia was the daughter of a coal and shipping fortune, so new the paint had scarcely dried on it, beautiful in the bold, confident way of a woman who has never once been refused, and she had recently become engaged to the Earl of Brereholt, whose ancient name and crumbling estate her father's money would restore. She talked through the entire fitting. She talked about the Earl, whom she found dull but rich in the things that mattered. She talked about the wedding, which would put every old family in the county in its place. And she talked idly, cruelly, about the unknown seamstress whose work she was wearing, the one Madame Pello employed in the back, the little nobody with the clever needle, the drudge, Florentia called her. To Madame Pello behind the curtain, not knowing the drudge knelt 3 feet away, with pins between her lips. One must have a drudge for the dull parts. It is what they are for. Adriana pinned the hem. Her hands did not shake. She set each pin a thumb's width from the last, the way her mother had taught her. And she kept her eyes on the silver thread and not on the woman wearing it. And she let the word drudge fall past her the way rain falls past a window that has decided not to let it in. She had learned by then that the surest way to survive being unseen was to refuse to flinch at it. There was a moment, kneeling there, when Florentia turned before the long glass and the celadon silk caught the gray light from the window, and even Adriana, who had made it, was stilled by how it moved. She had built that gown to make a woman look like the answer to a question. She had not known the woman would be this one. She finished the hem and gathered her pins and went back behind the curtain to the small hard chair that was her place, and she did not let herself think about whose betrothal the gown was for, because she had already half guessed. and the guessing hurt in a way she had no right to feel. She would have gone on unseen, forever perhaps, if not for the man on the stairs. It happened the following week. Adriana had carried the finished gown to Brereholt Hall herself, because the silk was too precious to trust to a carter, and she had been shown to a side passage to wait while the housekeeper fetched the fee. The passage gave onto the great library through a half-open door, and through that door Adriana saw the Earl of Briarholt for the first time, alone, standing at the cold hearth with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that no one had arranged for company. He looked, she thought, like a house with all its shutters closed. Tall, dark-haired, a jaw like the edge of a shut book, and gray eyes fixed on the middle distance, as if something there had cost him a great deal. She knew, vaguely, the story that the whole county knew, that the Earl had lost a younger brother to the war 3 years past, that the estate had been bleeding money since his father's death, that the marriage to the Coswick fortune was the only thing standing between Briarholt Hall and the auctioneer. The county told it as gossip standing in the passage, watching his face. Adriana understood it as grief. He turned and caught her there, and for one long moment, neither of them moved. She expected him to be angry. Servants did not linger at library doors. Instead, he looked at the gown box in her arms, and then at her face, and something in his closed expression shifted by a degree she would not have believed measurable. "You made it," he said. It was not a question. She did not know how he knew. She said nothing, which was its own answer. "The forget-me-nots." He said, "My mother grew them. She died when I was 9. He paused, and the pause held more than the words had. "I would know that flower anywhere. No one in this house has worked it in 20 years. Adriana found to her horror that her eyes had filled. "My mother grew them too," she said, before she could stop herself. The words were out plain and bare, and they were the first true thing she had said aloud to anyone in Maycomb in 6 months. The Earl looked at her for a moment longer. Then the housekeeper returned with the fee, and the moment shut like a door, and Adriana curtsied and took her coins and went back down the hill to her cold room above the chandlers. Something had happened, though, that she could not unhappen. A man with a face like a closed house had opened a single shutter, and had looked out, and had seen her. Not the drudge, not the hands behind the curtain. Her. She told herself it meant nothing. She was right to tell herself so and wrong to believe it, and the distance between those two things is where the rest of the story lives. What she did not yet know was that the Earl of Briarholt had begun, very quietly, to make inquiries. The weeks that followed were the cruelest kind, the kind that fill with small electric moments a wiser woman would have refused to count. The Earl found reasons to be near. A second gown was commissioned, a third, each order arriving through Madame Pello with the same strange specificity. The same insistence on a motif worked Adriana's particular way, and Adriana understood at last that the orders were a language, that he was speaking to her through the only channel the world left open, and that each one said the same impossible sentence: "I see you. I am still looking." He could say no more than that. He was an engaged man, bound by honor and by debt to a marriage he could not break without ruining his name and beggaring his tenants, and he was not a man who broke his word. Adriana was a fallen gentlewoman with a needle, which in the eyes of the world was lower than a lady's maid. There was no road from where she stood to where he stood. There was only the work passing back and forth between them, and the held looks at the fittings she was sometimes permitted to attend, and once on the stairs, his hand at her elbow for the length of a single breath, as she stumbled on the worn carpet, his fingers closing and then deliberately, painfully opening again. Florentia noticed everything that touched what she considered hers. She did not know who Adriana was. She knew only that her betrothed, who had been cold to her with the particular courtesy of a man performing a duty, had grown colder still, and that his coldness had a direction now, an attention pointed somewhere she could not see. A woman like Florentia does not tolerate. A rival she cannot name. She set about finding her, and being clever and rich, and entirely without scruple, she found her quickly. It was Tamsel who brought the warning, breathless up the back stair on a wet March evening. The grand Miss Coswick had come to Madame Pello's that afternoon, Tamsel said, and had been closeted with the modiste for an hour, and money had changed hands, a great deal of it, and afterward Madame Pello had given orders that the new commission, the most important of all, was to be kept secret even from Adriana until the very last. Adriana set down her needle. "What commission?" Tamsel's face was white. "I heard her say it myself." "Through the door, miss. She called you the back stair drudge, the one who does the dull parts," and she laughed when she said it. And then she laid down the money. Tamsel swallowed. "They are saying Miss Coswick means to wear your work to her own betrothal breakfast, miss, and to let the whole county believe she designed it herself to be admired for it, to be thought a woman of rare taste, fit for an earl. And Madame Pello is to swear, if anyone asks, that the design was Miss Coswick's own, sketched by her own hand, and that you only stitched what she drew. It was worse than theft. Theft takes a thing and leaves you alive. This took the only thing Adriana had made wholly her own, her one inheritance, her mother's hidden flower, and pressed it into the hands of the woman marrying the one man who had ever looked at her and seen, and called it the bride's. It would stand in the great hall of Briarholt as proof of Florentia's worth. It would be the very thing that made the Earl's bride admirable in his own house. And Adriana would stand at the servant's door and watch the man she could not have admired, her own stolen heart, on the body of the woman who had stolen it. She understood then why Florentia had done it. The dismissal of the drudge had a purpose. Now Florentia had heard, somehow, that the Earl's cold attention pointed toward a seamstress, and rather than dismiss the girl, she had chosen to wear her, to absorb her, to take the rival's one excellence and make it her own ornament, so that whatever the Earl admired, he would have to admire in his wife. It was, Adriana thought, almost brilliant. It was the strategy of a woman who had never lost. For a long while, Adriana believed the matter settled against her, and in the cold weeks of late winter, she made a choice she did not yet understand. As a choice, she might have refused the final commission. She might have fled Maycomb and taken her needle to some town that had never heard of an earl. Instead, she went on stitching, and into the lining of that final gown, where no one would ever look, where the basting would be cut away and discarded before the gown was ever worn. She worked one more small flower. A single forget-me-not, in silver marked in the secret manner her mother had left her. And then she said nothing, and waited, and let Florentia take the gown. If you have ever held a true thing in your hands and watched another claim it, you know the particular silence of those weeks. Stay with that silence a moment. It is where she lived. The betrothal breakfast was set for the first morning of April, and all the county came, and the great hall of Briarholt Hall filled with the families that had refused to read Adriana's letters of introduction a half a year before. Florentia descended the staircase in Celadon's silk and silver thread, and the room caught its breath, and the work was called beautiful, and the work was called hers. And the Earl of Briarholt watched the bride descend in the gown he had commissioned through a stranger's hands, and his face, to anyone watching, was the proper face of a man pleased with his bride. Only Adriana, near the servant's door, saw what lived under it. She saw a man looking at a flower. He knew the way he knew his own grief, on the wrong woman's body claimed in the wrong woman's name, and she saw the exact moment he understood what had been done, not to the gown, to her. He said nothing. He could say nothing. A gentleman does not denounce his bride before the county on the morning of his betrothal. He bowed over Florentia's gloved hand, and he led her into the breakfast. And Adriana carried the cooling chocolate back to the kitchens and told herself this was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Florentia was not a woman to leave an enemy standing once she had found her. It was at the breakfast over the long table that the dowager who had taken Florentia under her wing, a sharp-faced widow called Lady Hathersage, raised the matter of the gown. She did it kindly, in the way of a woman setting a trap, baited with a compliment. "Such exquisite work, my dear," she said loud enough for the table. "One hears the strangest rumor. That it was not your design at all. That you employed some little needlewoman in the town, some fallen creature, and that she now goes about claiming the credit. How wounding for you. You must put a stop to it." The whole table turned to Florentia, and Florentia, who had prepared for exactly this, smiled and was wounded and was gracious. There was such a woman, she allowed. A poor thing she had taken on out of charity, to do the plain stitching, the dull parts. It was true the creature had grown above herself, had begun to claim the design as her own, the ungrateful wretch. Anyone could see the absurdity of it, surely. Did the table truly imagine that a backstair drudge had conceived a gown fit for the Earl of Briarholt's bride? The design was her own, sketched by her own hand. She had the sketches still, and Madame Pelot to swear to it. It was beautifully done. It armored her completely. She had not merely stolen the gown, she had stolen the story, and barbed it, so that any defense Adriana might mount would only confirm her as a grasping liar reaching above her station, a drudge claiming a lady's work. The county would not even need to deliberate. This was the dismissive label, voiced now for the second time, and in the cruelest setting, before the assembled county, by the woman who wore the theft on her own back. The first time it had been a private aside behind a fitting-room curtain. Now it was public and weaponized, and meant to bury the truth, past digging, and it would have buried it had the Earl of Briarholt not set down his fork. He did not raise his voice. He was not a man who raised his voice. He said into the small silence after Florentia's speech that he found himself curious. That a design so particular, with so unusual a flower, surely had a maker who could account for it. That it would be the simplest thing in the world to send for the needlewoman in question, and for the sketches Miss Coswick spoke of, and let the matter be settled in the open, before the county as a point of honor. He would not have his betrothal touched by a rumor of theft. He said his voice level, whichever way it fell. Lady Hathersage's smile thinned. This was not the trap she had set. Florentia, for the first time in her gilded life, felt the floor shift, but she had no graceful way to refuse, and so she agreed as one agrees to a thing one cannot prevent, and a footman was sent down the hill to Gilmore Street to fetch the drudge. What none of them knew was that the Earl of Briarholt had spent the past 2 months learning exactly who the drudge was. He had sent his man of business to inquire above the chandler's shop. He had learned the name Verrindale, and the acreage at Selsdon, and the French modiste grandmother, and the dead mother who had grown forget-me-nots. He had pieced it together as carefully as Adriana pieced a seam, and he had said nothing to anyone, and he had waited, because he was a man who did not act until he could act all at once and irrevocably, and because he had needed Florentia to commit her lie fully before the whole county, before he let the truth into the room. The footman found Adriana in the kitchen passage, and she came. She came up the back stair and into the great hall in her grey working dress, with threads still caught at her cuff, and 200 faces turned to look at the fallen creature, the back-stair drudge, the grasping liar who claimed a lady's work. Florentia watched her come with the serene confidence of a woman who held every card. Lady Hathersage watched with open contempt. And the Earl watched with no expression at all, which Adriana had learned to read as the deepest attention he possessed, and she took one breath and understood that her whole life had narrowed to the next several minutes. Florentia spoke first, gracious and pitying, performing for the room there. She is the poor thing. I do not blame her truly. It is hard to be nobody. She turned to the table. All sweet reason. Show us your sketches then. You claim the design. Show the county the drawings from which you say you worked. Surely a true designer keeps her drawings. It was the perfect attack. Adriana had no sketches. She had never sketched the design. It had come out of her hands and her grief, directly into the silk, the way it had come out of her mother before her, with no paper between the heart and the work. To the room, the absence of drawings would prove the absence of the design. Florentia had built her lie precisely on the one ground where the truth had no evidence. Adriana looked at the sketches, Florentia's maid produced competent forgeries dated across the winter months, and she understood that Florentia had thought of everything a thief of objects would think of. She had forged the paper trail. She had bought the modiste. She had armored the story. She had defended her theft the way a clever general defends a stolen position, with falsified records and purchased witnesses, and there was no document in the world Adriana could produce to outweigh it. There was, however, a thing Florentia had not understood, because she had never made anything in her life. She had stolen a gown and thought she had stolen a design, and she did not understand the difference. The design was not the drawing. The design was the hand, and the hand could not be forged or bought or sketched after the fact, because it lived in a secret only its maker carried. Adriana did not reach for the sketches. She asked, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. For the gown, the room stirred. Florentia, thrown, asked what she could possibly mean. "The gown you are wearing," Adriana said. "The hem." She turned to the Earl, and then to the table, and she spoke plainly, because plainness was the only weapon she had ever owned. Anyone may copy a flower they have seen. Anyone may sketch forget-me-nots after the fact, and date the paper backward. The woman who made this gown, though, left a mark in it that she told no living soul, because her mother taught her that a woman should leave her mark in a place no one thinks to look. That mark, she said, no forgery could reach. She turned back to Florentia. Every flower on that hem has 5 petals. On every single one, the 5th petal is left a stitch short and closed instead with a knot turned inward, so that it reads as whole from a distance, but is not. There are 41 flowers on that hem. I worked every one. I will tell you, before I touch it, that the 3rd flower from the left front seam has its knot turned the wrong way, because my needle slipped that morning, and I chose not to unpick it. Send for a glass. Look. The silence in the hall changed its quality entirely. Lady Hathersage, frowning, called for a reading glass. A footman knelt at Florentia's hem with the glass, and the room leaned in, and the footman counted, and his face changed, and he looked up and said, in a voice gone strange, that there were 41 flowers, and that every 5th petal was a stitch short and knotted inward, and that the 3rd flower from the left front seam had its knot turned backward. Exactly as the seamstress had said. It was not yet enough. A clever woman could claim a lucky guess. So Adriana did the thing that could not be a guess. She asked Tamsel, who had slipped in at the back, to bring the work-basket she had carried up the hill. And from the basket Adriana took a scrap of the same Celadon silk, an offcut saved from the cutting, and a needle already threaded with the silver. And there, before the whole county, with her hands that did not shake, she worked a single forget-me-not. 5 petals. The last of them deliberately unfinished, closed instead with that inward-turning knot. The same flower, born again out of the same hand, identical to the 41 on the hem, because it came from the same place they had come from, a place no sketch could reach and no money could buy. She held it up beside the gown. They were the same. They were unmistakably, undeniably the same hand. No one in the hall spoke. And then the Earl of Briarholt rose from his chair. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He stopped before Adriana, and he looked down at the small flower in her raw, clever hands. And then he looked at her face. The face the county had decided was nobody's, and he said, in the level voice that derived all its authority from how rarely he spent it, 4 words that 12 months of her life had not prepared her to hear. "This is Miss Verrindale." The name dropped into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Miss Verrindale. Not the drudge, not the creature. A name, a family, a person, spoken by an earl in his own great hall before the whole county. He went on, still level, still quiet, and what he said next was the thing he had been unable to say for 6 months, and could say now because the truth was finally standing in the room. He said that the design was hers, that the hand was hers, that he had known it from the first gown because his own mother had worked that flower and no one else living knew the manner of it, and that he would not marry a woman who had stood before his county and claimed another woman's heart as her own ornament. He said it without cruelty. He said it the way one closes an account. The betrothal, he said, was ended. Florentia did not collapse. All at once, she was not built to collapse. She rose white-lipped, and she reached for the story one last time, and her voice, for the first time in the whole of her gilded life, fragmented under her. She said the creature had bewitched him. She said it was a trick, a cheat, a low woman's cunning. She said her father would. She said the county would. She said, and then she stopped because she saw, in the faces turned toward her, that the county had already decided, and that the verdict had gone against her, and that no amount of her father's money could buy it back. The room she had meant to conquer had seen her plainly at last. It was Lady Hathersage who finished it, in the end, and not unkindly, which was the strangest mercy of the morning. The old woman looked at the two flowers, the one on the hem and the one in Adriana's hand, and she set down her reading glass, and she said to no one in particular that she had been wrong and that she was too old to pretend otherwise, and that the girl had earned her name. Then she rose and gathered Florentia under her wing as she had at the start, but differently now, the way one gathers up a thing that must be taken home and quietly mended, rather than displayed. And she led the bride who had stolen a gown out of the great hall and out of the story, displaced from the place she had meant to own, corrected, humbled, but not destroyed. Florentia would marry in time a man who valued her father's coal and asked nothing of her heart, and she would never again wear another woman's work, and that was punishment enough, and the story asked for no more. The county did not erupt. This was not a story that erupted. It settled the way truth settles, into the low murmur of 200 people rearranging in their minds the thing they had been so sure of an hour before. The fallen creature was of Verrendale of Selsdon. The drudge had a name, and the Earl of Briarholt was looking at her, in front of all of them, with his shutters open and the closed house lit from within. Here, the warm part. After the county had gone, after the great hall had emptied, and the long tables were stripped and the April light had gone gold and slanting across the old stone floor, the Earl of Briarholt found Adriana standing alone by the cold hearth where she had first seen him through a half-open door. She was still holding the small silk flower. She did not know what to do with her hands, or her name, or the strange new largeness of the room now that she was permitted to stand in it. He came and stood near her, not too near, the proper distance, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, because the most important things between them had always been said in the work, and not in words. "You knew," she said at last, "from the first gown. You knew it was me." "I knew it was you," he said, "before I knew your name." He turned the next words carefully, as a man turns a thing that has cost him to carry. "After my brother died, I closed every shutter in this house. I told myself I would marry the money, and save the land, and feel nothing, because feeling had only ever cost me." He looked at the flower in her hand. "And then a gown came up the hill with my mother's flower worked into the hem by a hand I had never met, and I felt something, for the first time in 3 years, and I was so angry about it that I commissioned 3 more gowns just to be sure it was real." Adriana laughed, a small startled sound, the first laughter she had spent in Maycomb. "And was it real?" she asked. The Earl of Briarholt, who did not smile, very nearly smiled. It was the most significant thing his face had done in 3 years, and Adriana watched it happen, and understood that she was being given something he had given no one since the war took his brother. "It was real," he said. "It is real." He did not propose to her that afternoon. He was not a man to rush from one betrothal into another in the space of a single day, and she was not a woman who would have let him. He asked instead if he might call upon her properly, as a man calls upon a woman whose name he knows. And she, who had been invisible for so long that she had forgotten what it was to be addressed, said yes. And the yes cost her nothing, because it was the truest thing she had said since the forget-me-nots. The spring came on. He called and called again, and the county that had decided she was nobody revised its verdict the way the county always did once the truth was awake among them. and found to its own surprise that it had always rather admired the Verandales of Selsdon. Adriana did not gloat. She had no taste for it, and no need of it. She let her work speak as it always had, and the work was finally permitted to bear her name, and the ladies who had once refused her letters now begged for her hand at their hems, and she gave it at a fair price, and kept the back room above the chandler's, and kept Tamsel, who was no longer an apprentice but a partner. Because a woman who has been forgotten does not forget the one who stood by her in the cold. By Christmas they were married. It was a small wedding, by the standards of the county, in the old chapel at Briarholt, with the snow coming down past the windows, and Adriana wore a gown of warm cream that she had cut and stitched herself, with a hem worked in silver forget-me-nots marked in her mother's hidden manner, the small, deliberate flaw at the heart of every bloom, and the way her mother had invented and taught to no one else living. No one stole it this time. No one could. It was hers in front of God and the county and the man who had known her hand, before he knew her face, and when he took that hand at the altar his fingers closed and did not, this time, deliberately open again. On the last evening of that first married winter, the Earl of Briarholt came into the small warm sitting-room. His wife had made her own, and found her by the fire with her work-basket open on her knee, and a needle moving in the firelight. She was stitching. He saw a border of small blue flowers along the hem of a child's nothing, a christening gown begun long before there was any need of one, the way a woman stitches when she is happy and does not quite believe it yet. He sat down across from her and watched her hands move, the raw, clever hands that had made everything in his house worth keeping, and he did not speak, because the most important things between them had always been said in the work. She did not look up. She did not need to. She knew the turn of his attention the way she knew the turn of a seam. She set one more stitch and gave the small flower its hidden flaw, in the place no one thinks to look, and left her mark there in the firelight where it would stay, hidden and whole, for as long as the small, blue flowers held. If Adriana's story has stayed with you, sit a moment longer in that firelit quiet before you go, and carry it with you, the way she carried her mother's flower, into whatever room the world has decided you do not belong in. Thank you for staying until the end.